Craxon stuck a cold barrel against Arthur Foster's forehead, screaming, "What kind of primitive rodent beasts fight with such dishonorable deception? These fluffy Earth warriors surprise me. They will regret threatening Vulcan supremacy while looking so damned cute." The auditorium bustled into a frenzy of footsteps and shouts as the Vulcan extremists stormed in. They were led by Craxon, a militant xenophobe, who took the stage and the lone human hostage at gunpoint. "I have a neutrino bomb planted somewhere in the city. It will go off in 1 hour and kill millions of Vulcans. I want all non-Vulcans off the planet immediately and forever. Or else." Craxon tightened his grip on Arthur's head, starting with this lesser creature. Things were tense. The extremist group took the scientists hostage, locking down the auditorium and cutting all outside communication. It was on Arthur to find a way to outwit these terrorists, locate and defuse the neutrino bomb, and save millions of Vulcan lives. And he didn't have much time. But the human had a few tricks up his sleeve. Arthur knew Vulcan psychology and how to use their strict adherence to logic against them. He also brought something the Vulcans would never expect, a small troop of fluffy, adorable mammals from Earth. One specifically trained for combat and bomb sniffing. The Vulcans always underestimated humans as primitive and overly emotional, but sometimes a little ingenuity, unpredictability, and help from cute and cuddly soldiers was exactly what a situation called for. Arthur just hoped his plan worked in time, or else this lecture hall would be his and millions of Vulcans' tomb. Arthur's mind whirred, seeking a solution to alert the Vulcan authorities outside. Glancing down, he spotted a hidden panel beneath his seat. With his knowledge of Vulcan tech, he discreetly popped it open, revealing the environmental controls. Arthur tapped at the screen, modulating the auditorium's temperature in a distinct pattern, praying the security forces would recognize it as a coded SOS. Craxon paced the stage, his agitation swelling as the deadline neared. He yanked a Vulcan scientist to her feet, pressing his disruptor to her head. "I want the High Council on the calm now, or logical brains start splattering the walls." Arthur's heart hammered, but he forced a calm exterior. He had to stall for time. Clearing his throat, he addressed Craxon. "Your demands are illogical. Even if all non-Vulcans leave, your neutrino bomb will kill indiscriminately. Is that what you want? Vulcan deaths?" The extremist leader faltered, his brows knitting. The other militants shifted uneasily, Arthur's words taking root. Suddenly, a cacophony of phaser fire and shouts erupted beyond the doors. The Vulcan commandos had arrived. As the terrorists turned in alarm, Arthur lunged, tackling Craxon in a desperate bid to subdue him. They crashed to the floor, grappling for dominance. Arthur's fingers brushed against Craxon's temple, detecting a metallic device. A neural interface, if Arthur could just... Arthur's fingers yanked at Craxon's neural interface. It detached with a click, metal prongs sliding free from the Vulcan's skull. The extremist leader slumped into unconsciousness as Arthur scrambled to his feet, device in hand. "I need a terminal now," Arthur barked. The Vulcan commandos secured the remaining terrorists, while one led Arthur to a computer panel. He jacked the interface in, lines of code spilling across the screen. Arthur's eyes flicked back and forth, absorbing the data. "There," he jabbed a finger at a schematic. "The neutrino bomb. It's in a lab under the city's main power station." The commando's eyes widened a fraction. "How much time?" Arthur swallowed hard. 30 minutes. The Vulcans moved like a well-oiled machine, relaying the intel and mobilizing a bomb squad. As they prepared to depart, Arthur stepped forward. "I'm coming with you." The lead commando raised an eyebrow. "This is a Vulcan matter. Your assistance is no longer required." Arthur set his jaw. "That's a piece of human tech down there, cobbled together from scavenged parts, but still based on Earth engineering principles. You need me." The Vulcans exchanged looks, a silent debate passing between them. Finally, the leader inclined his head. "Very well, but you will follow orders." Arthur nodded curtly and fell into step beside the bomb disposal team as they double-timed it to the power station. The sleek, geometric structure loomed before them, its facade betraying no hint of the danger lurking beneath. The team descended into the bowels of the facility, the air growing colder and damper with each level. Arthur's skin prickled with unease. Craxon was clever. He wouldn't have made this easy. His suspicions were confirmed as they encountered the first trap. A grid of crisscrossing laser beams barred their path, the slightest touch promising to trigger an alarm or worse. The Vulcans paused, analyzing the problem with the dispassionate logic of a chess player. But Arthur's mind was already whirring, gears turning in distinctly human patterns. The Vulcans looked skeptical, but Arthur was already moving, prying open the grate and hoisting himself inside. With a resigned sigh, the bomb squad followed. They navigated the cramped, winding ducts, Arthur leading the way with a combination of instinct and half-remembered schematics. The next obstacle came in the form of a pressure-sensitive floor, the tiles rigged to detect even the slightest weight. Once again the Vulcans hesitated, calculating probabilities and force distributions. But Arthur had a simpler solution. He shucked off his boots and socks, then carefully removed a ceiling panel. With cat-like grace he hauled himself up and over, using the exposed pipes and beams to traverse the room from above. The Vulcans watched in silent astonishment as the human swung and clambered his way across, dropping soundlessly to the other side. With a shrug and a grin, Arthur opened the door for them. And so it went, Arthur's unorthodox tactics guiding them through each trap and pitfall. The Vulcans, for all their vaunted logic, found themselves increasingly reliant on the humans' quick wit and creative problem-solving. At last, they reached the final chamber. The neutrino bomb squatted in the center of the room, a twisted mass of wires and circuitry that pulsed with malevolent energy. A countdown blinked on its display, 10 minutes remaining. As the Vulcan bomb techs approached, a smooth female voice echoed from the device. Unauthorized personnel detected. Please input disarmament code. The Vulcans exchanged glances, uncertainty flickering in their eyes, but Arthur stepped forward, mind racing. A code. A cipher devised by a madman steeped in hatred and extremism. It would be something significant to Craxon, something that encapsulated his twisted worldview. Arthur thought back to the dossier he'd read on the terrorist leader. His history, his writings, the grandiose speeches he'd given to his followers. There was a phrase he'd used repeatedly, a rallying cry for his cause. A perversion of Surak's teachings, recast in the language of xenophobia and supremacy. Arthur's fingers flew over the keypad, inputting the words that had haunted his nightmares for weeks. For a heartbeat, nothing happened. Then with a soft beep, the countdown froze. The bomb lay dormant, neutered by the very ideology that had spawned it. The Vulcans stared at Arthur, a newfound respect in their eyes. He met their gaze, exhaustion and triumph warring on his face. Let's get this thing out of here. We've got a city to save. As the bomb tech set to work dismantling the device, Arthur allowed himself a moment to breathe. It had been close, too close for comfort. But they had done it. Human ingenuity and Vulcan logic, working in tandem to thwart a greater evil. He could only hope that this was the beginning of a new era of cooperation between their peoples, an era in which both sides learned from each other, grew together. An era in which the likes of Craxon and his ilk would find no foothold, no quarter, for in the face of a united front, hate could never prevail. Arthur smiled to himself, a grim sort of satisfaction settling in his chest. It had been one hell of a day, but then again that was life on Vulcan for you. Never a dull moment when you were the only human in a world of pointy-eared logicians, and Arthur wouldn't have had it any other way. The chamber echoed with a chorus of frustrated grunts and muttered curses as the team frantically tried to crack the code. Arthur's fingers flew over the keypad, his brow furrowed in concentration. Suddenly a memory flickered in his mind, his verbal sparring match with Craxon, the extremist's fervent devotion to a particular Vulcan philosopher, the one who preached pure logic, untainted by emotion. Arthur's eyes widened. He turned to the Vulcan bomb tech beside him. T'Pol, that philosopher Craxon, kept quoting. What was that line about the supremacy of logic? T'Pol's eyebrow arched. The only true path is that of logic unencumbered, she recited. Arthur nodded, a grin spreading across his face. He punched the phrase into the AI interface, his heart hammering in his chest. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, with a soft chime, the countdown froze. The team stared in disbelief as the numbers blinked harmlessly at them. 0-3. A cheer went up from the Vulcans, their usually stoic faces creased with relief. They set to work dismantling the bomb, carefully removing each component until the device lay in harmless pieces. As they emerged from the underground lab, blinking in the sudden sunlight, Arthur was stunned to see a massive crowd gathered outside the power plant. Vulcans of all ages and ranks stood shoulder to shoulder, their eyes fixed on the human and his team. When they caught sight of the neutralized bomb, a roar went up from the assembly. Vulcans clapped and cheered, their voices rising in a cacophony of praise and gratitude. Arthur stood there dumbfounded, as the same Vulcans who had once regarded him with cold disdain now hailed him as a hero. T'Pol stepped forward, raising her hand in the traditional Vulcan salute. The human Arthur Foster has saved countless Vulcan lives this day, she declared, her voice carrying over the crowd. He has proven himself a true friend and ally to our people. The cheers redoubled, washing over Arthur in a wave of sound and emotion. He felt a lump form in his throat, a mixture of pride and humility that threatened to overwhelm him. In the days that followed, the Vulcan High Council convened a special session to honor Arthur and the bomb disposal team. The chamber was packed to capacity, dignitaries and citizens alike craning to catch a glimpse of the heroes. The council leader, an aged Vulcan with a regal bearing, stepped to the podium. He fixed Arthur with a penetrating gaze, his dark eyes glinting with something like respect. Arthur Foster, he began, his voice a rich baritone, you have demonstrated the invaluable role that humans and other alien species can play in our society. Your ingenuity, your courage, and your commitment to the preservation of Vulcan lives have earned you the highest esteem of this council and our people. He paused, letting the weight of his words settle over the chamber. In light of your actions, we hereby announce a new initiative to foster greater cooperation and understanding between Vulcans and our galactic neighbors. Let this be the beginning of a new era of collaboration and mutual respect. The audience erupted in applause, Vulcans and aliens alike rising to their feet in a standing ovation. Arthur felt a hand on his shoulder and turned to see a high-ranking Vulcan official at his side. Craxon and his followers have been apprehended, the official murmured, his voice low and urgent. They will face the full force of Vulcan justice for their crimes. There is another matter that requires your attention, he continued, his eyes darting around the room. We have been monitoring a growing threat from a hostile species known as the Zorgans. Our intelligence suggests they are planning an invasion of Vulcan space. Arthur's blood ran cold. An invasion? Just when they had achieved a fragile peace, a new danger loomed on the horizon. He met the official's gaze, his jaw set with determination. Tell me everything, he said, his voice steel. If the Zorgans want a fight, they've picked the wrong planet to mess with. The official nodded, a glimmer of approval in his eyes. Come with me, he said, gesturing to a side door. We have much to discuss. As Arthur followed him out of the chamber, the weight of his new mission settled on his shoulders. He had saved Vulcan from one crisis, but it seemed his work was far from over. But he was ready to face whatever challenges lay ahead, ready to stand shoulder to shoulder with his Vulcan allies and defend their world from any threat. For he was Arthur Foster, the human who had proven his worth on an alien world, and he would not rest until Vulcan was safe, no matter the cost. The Vulcan official led Arthur into a high-security briefing room. Holographic displays sprang to life, showing star maps and tactical readouts. Arthur's eyes widened as he took in the scope of the Zorgan threat. They've already conquered a dozen systems, the official explained, pointing to a cluster of red dots on the map. Their technology is advanced, their ships heavily armed. We estimate they could reach Vulcan space within a month. Arthur leaned forward, studying the data. What do we know about their culture, their psychology? Every species has a weakness. The official tapped a few commands, bringing up a new set of images. Our intelligence is limited, but we have observed one peculiar trait. The screen showed a hulking Zorgon warrior, all spikes and armor, cuddling a small fluffy creature. Its face was split in a goofy grin, all thoughts of conquest forgotten. They seem to have a surprising affinity for cute and cuddly life forms, the official continued. It's a trait we've never seen in such an aggressive species. Arthur's mind raced, an idea taking shape. What if we could turn that weakness into a weapon? We genetically engineer a series of creatures, each designed to disrupt Zorgon technology. Electromagnetic pulses, insatiable appetites for power cables, that sort of thing. But we make them irresistibly cute. Cute and cuddly warriors, the official mused. An interesting concept, but how would we deploy them? Smuggle them onto Zorgon ships, bases, anywhere they can cause maximum chaos. The Zorgons won't know what hit them. The Vulcan considered this, his brow furrowed. The High Council will need convincing, but if your plan works, it could turn the tide of the coming war. Days later, Arthur stood in a secure Vulcan laboratory, watching as the first batch of cute and cuddly warriors took shape. There was a fluffy, purring creature that could emit targeted EMP bursts, a playful beast with a taste for Zorgon circuitry, and a dozen more, each more adorable and destructive than the last. They're perfect, Arthur grinned, scooping up a furry ball that immediately started nuzzling his cheek. The Zorgons won't stand a chance. As the Vulcans began smuggling the creatures into Zorgon territory, reports started trickling back. Malfunctioning ships, disabled weapons, hardened warriors reduced to cooing piles of mush. But the real test was yet to come. Intel suggested a massive Zorgon fleet was massing on the border of Vulcan space, preparing for a full-scale invasion. Arthur knew this was their chance to prove the true power of cute. He watched the tactical display, his heart pounding as a swarm of stealth pods carrying the cute and cuddly warriors infiltrated the Zorgon fleet. For a moment all was quiet. Then, one by one, the red dots began to wink out. A cheer went up in the command center as the Zorgon ship started to drift, powerless and confused. Video feeds showed Zorgon crews cuddling the adorable saboteurs, their fearsome visages split with goofy grins. "It's working," Arthur exclaimed, clapping the Vulcan official on the shoulder. "We've got them on the ropes." But even as they celebrated, a new alarm sounded. A second Zorgon fleet was dropping out of warp, twice the size of the first. And this time, they looked pissed. "They've adapted," the official frowned, studying the readouts. "They must have developed a countermeasure to our creatures." Arthur felt a chill run down his spine. If the Zorgons had found a way to resist the power of cute, then Vulcan was in serious trouble. They needed a new plan, and fast. "Bring up everything we have on Zorgon biology," Arthur said, his mind racing. "If cuteness won't work, we'll have to find another weakness." The lab became a hive of activity as Vulcan scientists pored over the data, searching for any clue that could give them an edge. Hours ticked by, the tension mounting with each passing minute. Just as despair was starting to set in, one of the researchers let out a cry of discovery. "Here, look at this!" Arthur and the official crowded around the display, eyes widening as they took in the findings. There, buried deep in the Zorgon genetic code, was a sequence they had never seen before. A sequence that, when properly stimulated, could trigger a cascade of neural reactions. A sequence that could, quite literally, make the Zorgons laugh themselves to death. Arthur felt a grin spreading across his face. "Gentlemen," he said, turning to the assembled Vulcans, "I believe we have our weapon." The lab erupted into a frenzy of activity as the scientists set to work, crafting a new breed of cute and cuddly warrior, one that wouldn't just disable Zorgon technology, but would target their very biology. Days later, As the Zorgon fleet loomed over Vulcan, a new swarm of pods burst from the planet's surface. They rocketed towards the invaders, each one carrying a payload of the most adorable, laughter-inducing creatures the galaxy had ever seen. The Zorgons never stood a chance. As the fluffy, giggling warriors infiltrated their ships, the Zorgon crews found themselves overwhelmed by a sudden, uncontrollable urge to laugh. They guffawed, they chortled, they roared with mirth until tears streamed down their faces. And then they simply stopped, smiles frozen on their faces, eyes glazed with the ecstasy of the ultimate punchline. One by one, the Zorgon ships went dark, drifting lifelessly in the void. The invasion was over before it had even begun, defeated not by phasers or photon torpedoes, but by the irresistible power of laughter. In the command center, Arthur and the Vulcans watched in stunned silence as the Zorgon fleet crumbled before their eyes. It was a victory beyond anything they could have imagined, a triumph of ingenuity and the unorthodox. And as the realization sank in, as the cheers and congratulations began to echo through the room, Arthur felt a sense of pride swelling in his chest. He, a lone human on an alien world, had helped save an entire planet. With a little bit of creativity, a dash of audacity, and the power of all things cute and cuddly. It was a strange universe, Arthur reflected, but it was one he was proud to be a part of, one where even the most unlikely of heroes could make a difference. One where laughter truly was the best medicine. The command center doors burst open, jolting Arthur from his thoughts. A Vulcan officer strode in, his face grave. "Sir," he said, addressing the official, "we've just received a transmission from the Zorgon homeworld. They're demanding our surrender." The room fell silent, the weight of the moment settling over them like a shroud. Arthur glanced at the official, saw the flicker of uncertainty in his eyes. But then, slowly, a smile began to spread across the Vulcan's face. He turned to Arthur, a glint of mischief in his eyes. "Well then," he said, "I believe it's time we introduced our Zorgon friends to the concept of a laugh riot." Arthur grinned, the tension broken. "I couldn't agree more," he said, rubbing his hands together. "Let's show them what real biological warfare looks like." And with that, the command center burst into a flurry of activity once more, as Vulcans and one very determined human set to work on their most audacious plan yet. The Zorgons wanted a war. Well, they were about to get one. A war fought not with ships and soldiers, but with the most powerful weapon of all. Pure, unadulterated silliness. It was a strange battlefield, Arthur mused, but it was one he was more than ready to command. After all, laughter wasn't just the best medicine. Sometimes it was the only cure for the universe's ills. Arthur cracked his knuckles, a smile playing at his lips. "All right, team," he said. "Let's get to work. We've got a galaxy to save and a whole lot of Zorgons to tickle." The command center erupted into cheers and applause, the spirit of camaraderie palpable in the air. They had come this far, defeated the odds at every turn. Now it was time to finish the job. To prove once and for all that, in the grand scheme of things, it wasn't the size of your fleet that mattered. It was the size of your heart. And as Arthur looked around at the faces of his Vulcan comrades, at the determination and joy shining in their eyes, he knew they had heart to spare. They were ready, ready to laugh in the face of danger, to giggle in the midst of chaos, ready to save the universe one chuckle at a time. The Zorgons wouldn't know what hit them. As the cute and cuddly warriors wreaked havoc across Zorgon space, the enemy's high command seethed with impotent rage. In their fortified war room, holographic displays flickered with reports of malfunctioning ships and giggling soldiers. The Zorgon leaders pounded the table, their claws gouging deep furrows into the metal. "This is impossible," the Supreme Commander roared. "No Vulcan could outsmart us like this. There must be a traitor in our midst." His subordinates cowered, each fearing accusation. But little did they know the real culprit was far closer than they realized. Deep in the bowels of the command center, Arthur Foster hunched over a console, his fingers flying across the controls. For weeks, He had been quietly infiltrating the Zorgon systems, using every trick in the human espionage playbook to gather vital intelligence. "I've got it," he whispered into his comm. "The location of their main command center, it's now or never." On the other end, the Vulcan strike team acknowledged. They had been preparing for this moment, honing their skills and their bond with the most elite, cute and cuddly warriors. Arthur took a steadying breath. This was it. The chance to strike a decisive blow against the Zorgons. He knew the risks, knew that he might not make it back. But someone had to do it. And who better than the sole human in this strange alien war? "I'm going in," he said. "See you on the other side." With that, he gathered his gear and his courage and set out to rendezvous with the Vulcan team. The journey through Zorgon territory was harrowing. At every turn, they faced fierce resistance from enemy security forces. Disruptor fire filled the air, the stench of ozone mixing with the acrid smell of fear. But the cute and cuddly warriors were in their element. They scampered and tumbled, emitting pulses and bursts that sent Zorgon weapons spinning out of control. They chewed through power lines and control panels, leaving a trail of adorable destruction in their wake. And slowly, inexorably, Arthur and his team pushed forward. At last they reached the perimeter of the command center. Towering walls of reinforced alloy loomed before them, bristling with weaponry. "This is it," Arthur said, steeling himself. "Let's show these Zorgons what cute can do." With a chorus of chirps and trills, the warriors surged forward. Zorgon defenses crumbled under their onslaught, the fearsome barriers reduced to so much shredded fluff and sparking wires. Arthur and the Vulcans charged in their wake, phasers blazing. They fought their way deeper into the complex, dispatching Zorgon troops with ruthless efficiency. But as they reached the heart of the command center, they faltered. There, amid a tangle of tubes and wires, was a sight that chilled their blood. Cute and cuddly warriors, twisted and warped almost beyond recognition. Their fur was matted and singed, their eyes glowing with an eerie red light. And at the center of it all, a small, unassuming creature, its body pulsing with an unnatural power. "Ah, the great Arthur Foster," a voice boomed. "At last we meet." The Zorgon Supreme Commander stepped from the shadows, his face split in a cruel grin. In his claws he held a control device, its surface flickering with malevolent energy. "How you like my pet?" he sneered, gesturing to the small creature. "A remarkable specimen, able to manipulate gravity fields at my command. With this, I will crush your precious Vulcan homeworld like an overripe fruit." Arthur's mind raced, desperate for a solution. The creature was the key. If he could free it from the Zorgon's control... But the commander was already moving, his finger tightening on the trigger. Arthur had only seconds to act. He locked eyes with the creature, willing it to understand. Then, with a desperate cry, he lunged for the control device, even as the commander's claw came down on the button. The world erupted into chaos. Gravity warped and twisted, sending friend and foe alike tumbling. Arthur grappled with the commander, the device sparking and hissing between them. And in that moment he saw his chance. With a final, desperate effort, he wrenched the device free and brought it down on the commander's head with all his strength. The Zorgon crumpled, his skull caved in like an eggshell. Arthur staggered back, gasping for breath. Around him the gravity slowly stabilized, the creature's power fading as it slipped from the Zorgon's control. He reached out a hand, and the small being hopped into his palm, nuzzling his fingers with a grateful chirp. He looked up, meeting the eyes of his Vulcan comrades. They were battered and bruised, but alive, and in their faces he saw something he had never seen before. "Let's finish this," Arthur said, his voice ringing with determination. "We've got a war to win." And with that they pressed on, deeper into the heart of the Zorgon stronghold. The battle was far from over, but one thing was certain. The Zorgons had underestimated the power of Cute for the last time. Arthur's mind raced as he faced down the Zorgon Supreme Commander, the gravity-manipulating creature, writhing in the alien's cruel grasp. He had to act fast, had to find a way to turn the tables. And then it hit him. The Zorgons didn't truly understand the cute and cuddly warriors. They couldn't, not really. They saw them as weapons, tools to be exploited, but Arthur knew better. He drew himself up, meeting the commander's gaze with steely resolve. "Release that creature," he demanded, his voice ringing with authority. "Release it now, or I'll be forced to activate the failsafe." The commander's eyes narrowed, his grip tightening on the squirming creature. "What failsafe?" Arthur reached into his pocket, pulling out a small, nondescript device. "This failsafe," he said, holding it up for the commander to see. "One press of this button, and every single cute and cuddly warrior will be deactivated, including the one you're holding." The commander hesitated, suspicion warring with fear on his alien features. "You're bluffing," he growled, but there was a note of uncertainty in his voice. "Am I?" Arthur challenged, his thumb hovering over the device's single button. "Are you willing to take that risk? To lose your most powerful weapon in this war?" For a long, tense moment, the commander stared at Arthur, his eyes flicking between the human's face and the device in his hand. Then, slowly, he lowered the gravity-manipulating creature to the ground. "Fine," he spat. "We'll negotiate." As the creature scampered away, Arthur fought to keep the relief from showing on his face. The bluff had worked, but they weren't out of the woods yet. Behind the commander, Arthur caught a flicker of movement. His Vulcan teammates, taking advantage of the distraction, were stealthily moving to free the captured creature. Arthur kept talking, keeping the commander's attention focused on him. He spoke of terms, of conditions, of compromises, all the while watching as his allies crept closer to their target. And then, in a blur of motion, they struck. The gravity creature was snatched from its bonds, wriggling free with a triumphant squeak. Chaos erupted. The creature, finally unshackled, began to wreak havoc on the command center, sending Zorgon soldiers and equipment flying with wild fluctuations in gravity. Consoles sparked and shattered, alarms blared, and in the midst of it all, Arthur and his team fought like demons. The cute and cuddly warriors were in their element, scampering and tumbling through the mayhem, tripping up Zorgon troops and chewing through vital wiring. They were a furry, adorable wave of destruction, and the Zorgons were powerless to stop them. Arthur ducked and weaved through the chaos, his phaser flashing as he laid down covering fire for his team. They had to get out, had to escape before the whole place came down around their ears. "This way," he shouted over the din, gesturing to a side corridor. The Vulcans fell in behind him, the cute and cuddly warriors bringing up the rear like a fluffy rearguard. They ran, faster than Arthur had ever run in his life. His lungs burned, his legs ached, but he pushed on, driven by desperation and the knowledge that they were so close to safety. And then, with a final frantic sprint, they were aboard, the hatch slamming shut behind them. The shuttle leapt into the sky, the Zorgon command center receding below them, still echoing with the sounds of chaos and destruction. As they broke atmosphere, Arthur slumped in his seat, exhaustion finally catching up with him. He looked around at his team, at the Vulcans and the cute and cuddly warriors, all battered and bruised but alive. Alive and victorious. "That failsafe," T'Pel said, turning to Arthur with a raised eyebrow. "It was a bluff, wasn't it?" Arthur grinned, holding up the device. "Just a remote control for my sound system back home," he admitted. "But hey, it worked, didn't it?" The Vulcans exchanged glances, and then, to Arthur's surprise, they began to chuckle. It was a strange sound coming from those usually stoic faces, but it was a welcome one. "Indeed," T'Pel said, a hint of a smile playing at her lips. "Perhaps there is something to be said for human ingenuity after all." But he knew this was just the beginning. The Zorgons would be back, angrier and more determined than ever, and Arthur would be ready for them. Ready with his wits, his courage, and an army of the cutest, cuddliest warriors the galaxy had ever seen. As Arthur settled into his role as strategic advisor, an uneasy quiet seemed to fall over Vulcan, but it was the calm before the storm. Reports started trickling in from distant colonies, whispers of a new threat. Arthur pored over the data, a sinking feeling in his gut. The Zorgons had been busy, it seemed, busy cooking up a fresh hell. A bioweapon, the report said. One tailored to target the cute and cuddly warriors. It infected them, twisted them, turned them from adorable allies into snarling, rampaging monsters. The first outbreak hit like a hammer blow. A remote Vulcan outpost, overrun in a matter of hours. Grainy video footage showed the carnage, fluffy creatures turned feral, tearing through the colony with terrifying strength and speed. Arthur slammed his fist on the table, the implications clear. This was no isolated incident. It was a test run, and if they didn't act fast, all of Vulcan could fall. He gathered his team, Vulcan scientists and tacticians, their faces grim. They worked around the clock, analyzing samples, running simulations. The virus was highly contagious, leaping from one cute and cuddly to the next with frightening ease, but it left other species untouched. It's a carrier virus, Arthur realized, dread coiling in his stomach. They're using the Cuddlies to spread it, to infect as many as possible before unleashing them on Vulcan. They needed a countermeasure, and fast. But traditional methods would take too long, allow the virus to spread unchecked. They needed something radical, something unexpected. An idea began to form in Arthur's mind. Risky, unorthodox, but it might just work. We fight fire with fire, he said, pulling up a schematic. We engineer a Trojan horse, a cuddly infected with a modified strain, one that will act as a vaccine. We let it loose among the rogue cuddlies, let the cure spread just as fast as the virus. The Vulcans exchanged uncertain looks. It was a gamble, a huge one. But what choice did they have? They worked feverishly, splicing genes, tweaking code. The vaccine strain came together, a delicate balance of lethality and benevolence. They chose their volunteer carefully, a brave little cuddly, small and unassuming. The perfect infiltrator. The mission was a go. They released the vaccine Cuddly near the outbreak site, watching with bated breath as it scampered into the fray. For a tense few hours there was no news. Then reports started coming in, rogue cuddlies slowing, stumbling, the madness fading from their eyes. The vaccine was working, spreading, the tide turning. But just as they began to celebrate, a new alarm sounded. Long-range sensors had picked up a massive Zorgon fleet, headed straight for Vulcan, and they were packing a deadly new weapon. Rogue cuddly detectors, T'Pol said grimly, pulling up the scans. They're coming to purge Vulcan of every last cute and cuddly, infected or not. Arthur stared at the screen, at the armada bearing down on them. They had stopped one crisis only to face another. The war, it seemed, was far from over. The command center erupted into a frenzy of activity, Vulcans scrambling to shore up planetary defenses, to evacuate key personnel and resources. But Arthur knew with cold certainty that it wouldn't be enough. Not against a force of that size, that determination. They needed a new plan, a new strategy, and they needed it fast. Arthur turned to his team, to the brilliant minds he had come to trust and rely on. "All right, people," he said, his voice steady despite the fear churning in his gut. "Let's brainstorm. We've pulled off the impossible before, and we'll do it again. This is what we trained for. This is what we fight for." He met each of their gazes, saw the resolve hardening behind their eyes. They were with him, come hell or high water. Together, they would find a way. They had to. The fate of Vulcan, of the cute and cuddly warriors, of everything they had fought for, hung in the balance. The Zorgons were coming, armed and ruthless, but Arthur and his team would be ready for them, ready to fight, ready to win, no matter the cost. Arthur's mind raced as he stood on the bridge of the Vulcan flagship, the holographic displays showing the massive Zorgon fleet bearing down on them. Time was running out, and they needed a plan. "We use their own tactics against them," Arthur said, his voice steady despite the tension in the air. "We create a diversion, make them think the rogue cuddlies are running rampant on a nearby planet." T'Pol, the Vulcan commander, raised an eyebrow. "A holographic projection?" Arthur nodded. Exactly. We lure them away, then spring the trap. The Vulcans set to work, their fingers flying over the consoles. Within minutes, the hologram was ready, a swarm of vicious, snarling Cuddlies materializing on the view screen. They watched breathless as the Zorgon fleet shifted course, moving towards the phantom outbreak. "They're taking the bait," Arthur murmured, a grim smile tugging at his lips. As the Zorgon ships entered orbit around the planet, the Vulcans made their move. A fleet of cloaked warships shimmered into existence, surrounding the enemy armada like a pack of wolves. The cute and cuddly warriors, now armed to the teeth with miniaturized weapons and EMP devices, swarmed towards the Zorgon ships. They slipped through hull breaches and airlock seals, scampering through the corridors and conduits. Zorgon crew members screamed in surprise and fear as the furry saboteurs burst onto their bridges and engineering decks. Consoles sparked and exploded, engines sputtered and died, and weapon systems fizzled out as the Cuddlies worked their adorable brand of havoc. In the midst of the pandemonium, Arthur and a team of Vulcan commandos materialized aboard the Zorgon flagship, phasers blazing. They fought their way through the ship, dispatching Zorgon guards with brutal efficiency. They burst onto the bridge, only to find the Supreme Commander waiting for them, a manic gleam in his eyes. "Surrender now," Arthur demanded, leveling his phaser at the Zorgon leader. The commander laughed, a harsh grating sound. "I think not, human. You see, I have a little surprise for you." He gestured to a console where a countdown was rapidly ticking down. "The reactor core rigged to blow. And not just this ship, but the entire fleet, including your precious Vulcan colony." Arthur's blood ran cold, but then he noticed something. A twitch in the commander's eye, a slight tremor in his voice. He was bluffing. "I don't think so," Arthur said, a sly grin spreading across his face. "In fact, I'm calling your bluff." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a deck of cards, the worn edges and faded symbols, marking them as a set used for interstellar poker. "One game," Arthur said, shuffling the deck with practiced ease. "Winner takes all, the fate of the fleet, the colony, everything." The commander stared at him, disbelief warring with a flicker of fear in his eyes. Then slowly he nodded. Arthur dealt the cards, his heart pounding in his chest. The stakes had never been higher, the fate of countless lives resting on the turn of a card. But as he looked at his hand, a glimmer of hope sparked in his chest. It was a good hand, a very good hand. He glanced up at the commander, saw the sweat beading on his brow, the twitch in his fingers as he clutched his cards. Arthur laid his cards on the table, a triumphant grin splitting his face. "Interstellar flush," he declared, his voice ringing through the bridge. "I win." The commander stared at the cards, his face going slack with shock and defeat. Around them, the Zorgon crew lowered their weapons, the fight draining out of them. As the Vulcan commandos secured the bridge and began rounding up the Zorgon prisoners, Arthur let out a long, shuddering breath. He had done it. Against all odds, he had outplayed the Supreme Commander and saved the day. But even as the elation of victory washed over him, Arthur knew that this was just the beginning. The Zorgons were defeated, but there would always be new threats, new challenges to face. And he would be ready for them, ready with his wits, his courage, and his trusty deck of cards. For he was Arthur Foster, the human who had become a legend among the stars, and his story was far from over. The Zorgon Supreme Commander's eyes narrowed as he studied Arthur, trying to gauge the human's sincerity. "You're bluffing," he growled, but a flicker of uncertainty crossed his face. Arthur leaned forward, his gaze unwavering. "There's only one way to find out, isn't there?" For a long moment the commander hesitated, the weight of the decision bearing down on him. Then, with a curt nod, he gestured to a nearby console. "Very well. We play." As the two adversaries took their seats, the tension on the bridge was palpable. The Vulcan commandos kept their weapons trained on the Zorgon crew, ready to act at the slightest provocation. Arthur shuffled the cards with practiced ease, his fingers nimble and sure. He dealt the first hand, the holographic cards shimmering in the air between them. The game began, a silent battle of wits and nerves. The commander played aggressively, his bets bold, and his demeanor arrogant. Arthur countered with a more measured approach, carefully analyzing his opponent's tells and mannerisms. As the hands progressed, the stakes grew higher. The commander's frustration mounted as Arthur's pile of virtual chips steadily grew. The humans seemed to have an uncanny ability to read the Zorgon's intentions, always staying one step ahead. In the background, Arthur's Vulcan allies worked feverishly to disable the flagship's overloading reactor. Sweat beaded on their brows as they navigated the complex alien systems, racing against time to avert catastrophe. The final hand was dealt, the cards lying face down on the console. The commander pushed his remaining chips into the center, his eyes glinting with a desperate intensity. "All in," he snarled. Arthur matched the bet, his expression inscrutable. The room held its breath as the cards were revealed one by one. The commander's face contorted in disbelief as Arthur's winning hand was laid bare. A flush of Altarian aces, the highest possible combination in interstellar poker. "Impossible," the Zorgon whispered, his voice hoarse with shock. "You couldn't have—" Arthur leaned back in his chair, a small smile playing at his lips. "I believe the human expression is, 'Read them and weep, Commander.'" The Zorgon slumped in his seat, defeat etched into every line of his face. With a shaking hand he reached for his communicator. "All units," he said, his voice hollow. "Stand down. We surrender." A cheer went up from the Vulcan commandos as the news spread throughout the fleet. The Zorgon ships powered down their weapons, the fight draining out of them. In the reactor room, the Vulcan engineers let out a collective sigh of relief as the overload sequence was aborted, the crisis averted. Arthur stood, his heart pounding with the thrill of victory. He had done it. Against all odds he had outplayed the Zorgon Supreme Commander and saved countless lives. But even as the congratulations and accolades poured in, a nagging sense of unease tugged at Arthur's mind. Something about this whole situation didn't sit right with him. He turned to T'Pol, his brow furrowed. "We need to investigate this further," he said, his voice low and urgent. "I have a feeling that there's more to this conflict than meets the eye." The Vulcan nodded, her expression grave. "Agreed. We must get to the bottom of this, no matter where the truth may lead." As the Zorgon prisoners were secured and the fleet prepared to return to Vulcan, Arthur couldn't shake the sense that their true battle was just beginning. A shadow lurked beneath the surface of this victory, and he was determined to drag it into the light. The journey back to Vulcan was a somber one, the weight of unanswered questions hanging heavy in the air. Arthur pored over the data they had collected, searching for any clue that might shed light on the Zorgon's true motivations. It was T'Pol who found the first lead, a series of encrypted transmissions buried deep in the Zorgon commander's personal logs. As they worked to decipher the messages, a chilling picture began to emerge. The Zorgons had not been acting alone. They had been aided and abetted by a faction within Vulcan itself, a shadowy cabal of extremists who sought to use the war as a means to seize power. Arthur felt a cold knot of dread form in his stomach as the pieces fell into place. The bioweapon, the targeting of the cute and cuddly warriors, the escalation of hostilities, it all made a twisted kind of sense. "They used the Zorgons as pawns," he said, his voice thick with disgust. "Manipulated them into attacking, all so they could step in and play the saviors." T'Pol's face was grim, her eyes hard. "And in doing so, they betrayed everything Vulcan stands for: logic, peace, the sanctity of life." As the evidence mounted, Arthur and his allies began to formulate a plan. They would expose the cabal, bring them to justice, no matter the cost. But even as they laid their trap, the extremists were already moving. Whispers of dissent began to spread through the streets of Vulcan cities, carefully crafted lies designed to sow fear and mistrust. Arthur found himself the target of a smear campaign, his loyalty questioned, his motives impugned. The very people he had fought so hard to protect now looked upon him with suspicion and doubt. But he refused to be cowed. With T'Pol and his loyal Vulcan friends at his side, Arthur pushed forward, determined to see this through to the bitter end. The final confrontation came in the heart of Vulcan's capital, in the very chambers of the High Council. Arthur stood before the assembled leadership, the evidence of the Cabal's treachery laid bare for all to see. There were gasps of shock, cries of outrage. The extremists, seeing their plans unraveling, lashed out in desperation. Phaser fire erupted, chaos descending upon the chamber. Arthur fought side by side with his Vulcan comrades, the cute and cuddly warriors diving into the fray with reckless abandon. They battled through the halls of power, confronting the Cabal's leaders one by one. In the end, they were victorious. The extremists were captured, their conspiracy laid to rest, but the cost had been high, too high. Arthur stood amidst the rubble, his uniform torn and scorched, his eyes hollow with grief. So many lives lost, so much damage done. And for what? The selfish ambitions of a few misguided individuals. He looked out over the shocked and shaken faces of the Vulcan people, saw the pain and betrayal etched into their features. This was not the world he had fought for, not the society he had come to love and respect. With a heavy heart, Arthur made his decision. It was time for him to go, to leave Vulcan and return to the familiarity of Earth. He had done what he could here, but the wounds ran too deep, the scars too fresh. As he packed his few belongings, T'Pol came to him, her expression somber. "You don't have to leave," she said softly, placing a hand on his shoulder. "Vulcan needs you now more than ever." Arthur shook his head, a sad smile on his lips. "Vulcan needs to heal," he replied, "and that's a journey it must take on its own. My presence here would only be a reminder of the pain, a symbol of the darkness that nearly consumed you." He turned to face her, his eyes shining with unshed tears. "But know this, T'Pol. My time here, fighting alongside you and your people, has been the greatest honor of my life. I will never forget what we achieved, or the bonds we forged." T'Pol nodded, her own eyes glistening. "Nor will we forget you, Arthur Foster. You will always have a home on Vulcan, and friends who stand ready to answer your call." With a final embrace, Arthur boarded his shuttle, a small contingent of cute and cuddly warriors at his side. As the craft lifted off, he looked back at the planet that had become his second home, the people who had become his family. He knew that the fight for justice, for peace, was far from over. There would always be those who sought to exploit and destroy, to sow chaos and discord. But he also knew that as long as there were those willing to stand against them, to fight for what was right, hope would endure. Arthur turned his gaze to the stars, to the vast expanse of the unknown that awaited him. Whatever challenges lay ahead, whatever darkness he might face, he would meet it head-on, with the courage and determination that had defined his time on Vulcan. For he was Arthur Foster, the human who had become a legend among the stars, and his story was just beginning. You have reached the end of the story. If you enjoyed this story and want to support us, please leave a like and subscribe to our channel, and for every comment that says 88, I will heart every single one of them. Thank you for your time.